Well, Jan-Werner Müller, welcome to Copenhagen and welcome to the Black Diamond. When you mention this building in English, it sounds more like a James Bond movie than a building, actually. We are here to talk about populism. And we're going to sort of narrow it from a theoretical standpoint about what is populism. And then we're going to talk about current affairs, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening in America as well. So we'll try to use your sort of theoretical wisdom and your historic perspective to look at the world as of today. So first of all, I'd like you to define the term populism.
Well, first of all, thank you for the warm welcome and thank you for presuming wisdom on my part. I hope I can make good on that rather grand promise. So how to define populism? There is no, as many of you will know, there is no universally agreed definition of populism among social scientists, historians, political commentators today. My take on the phenomenon results in a somewhat narrower concept of populism than many other people would propose. I think it's actually a political problem in Europe in particular today that the concept or the designation populism tends to get overstretched. Everything from the Spanish indignados to, let's say, the Greek Syriza party are called populists. And I think many of these parties, movements, individuals are in fact not populists. So what is a populist? My definition or my approach to it would say that populism works with a particularly moral conception of politics. It pits a homogeneous, innocent, usually hardworking, fully unified people against an elite that is, of course, defined in the contrary terms. So usually corrupt, usually not working, not serving the people, and very often not really properly belonging to the people at all. Very often then in right-wing populism in particular, one sees that image of the elite combined with a further, so to speak, enemy of the people, and those are those who are at the very bottom of society, who of course in the populist imagination also don't really work and don't really properly belong. Let me give you, if I may, one concrete example of that. In a number of Eastern European countries, for instance, the populist imagination precisely combines post-communist, usually left-wing elites with those at the very bottom or at the very margin of society, usually the Roma. And these sort of two colliding parts then also are often in the populist imagination supported by an illegitimate outside power. In the case here, of course, the European Union and maybe others too. But you see the same phenomena, for instance, in the United States, where for a long time the populist imagination sort of suspected a secret collusion between liberal, in the American sense of the word liberal, so somewhat left-wing social democratic, bi-coastal elites and African Americans at the very bottom of society. And the sort of absolute populist nightmare came, of course, true when these two were embodied in one man. You know, both an African American and a Harvard elite person.
Yeah.
So for them, this is sort of, for the populists, this is the worst possible scenario.
Exactly, but when we talk about populism in Europe and in the United States as well, when you refer to the Tea Party movement, we talk about right-wing nationalistic movements. Can you give any examples of a left-wing socialist populist party or movement?
There are far fewer than is usually assumed. So for instance, it's very often said that in France, there's a kind of symmetry between the Front National under Marine Le Pen and somebody like Mélenchon, who is seen as a left-wing populist versus Le Pen as a right-wing populist. I think that kind of symmetry usually doesn't work if you are willing to go with my understanding of populism. Because then you might still find lots of things wrong with a character like Mélenchon. You might say the policy proposals are simplistic, or you don't like the rhetoric for other reasons, but it doesn't have that particularly exclusionary move that I think is central to populism. It also doesn't have a characteristic, which I think, if I may, I would add further, namely that, contrary to what some people sometimes say, that, well, populism maybe sometimes is distasteful, but it's a kind of useful corrective for liberal democracy, because it's really an attempt to bring the people in, to make the people speak, to make the people participate, and as good Democrats, we all really want participation. I don't think that this is really a characteristic of populism as I understand it. Real mobilization, participation, is actually not part of populism. The populist wants the people as a kind of homogeneous object that should be represented ideally by the populist, because it's basically one unified body with one common will, aiming at one common good, and therefore capable of being represented by one party or even one person. But the people don't really have to be involved. So let me give you another, last, more right-wing example. Think of somebody like Berlusconi, who also very often made this rhetorical move of essentially saying, there's a real Italian people, and then there are these sort of post-communist lefties who don't really belong, and then there are, of course, illegal immigrants from Africa and Romanians and all kinds of other people who don't really belong to Italy. But the ideal Berlusconi supporter was basically somebody who would sit at home and watch the right TV channels, not somebody who would necessarily go out into the piazza and demonstrate and be very involved civically. So I think it's a mistake to equate populism with popular participation or mobilization.
But what about a strong leader? Berlusconi is whatever you think about him, is a very charismatic leader. Do a populist movement need a charismatic leader? Or, for instance, the Tea Party movement is one example where there isn't any leader. Is that possible?
Let's put it this way. It helps to have a charismatic leader to be successful. But that's true across the board in politics. I don't think, and again I think I disagree with a lot of other analysts, I don't think that having a charismatic leader is really intrinsic to populism. What is intrinsic is the claim that there is only one popular will, and that can be successfully embodied by one person, but doesn't have to be very charismatic necessarily, just symbolically and personally has to be able to say, I truly represent the true people's will. So if I may, I'll give you another example. The post-Jörg Haider leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, who I think was, I dare say, not a particularly charismatic person, was always campaigning on the slogan, denkt wie wir, he thinks like us. Nobody ever said what he actually thinks, but of course everybody sort of knew what he thinks. But the point was simply the claim that here is somebody, no matter what the personal characteristics, who somehow successfully can represent the true people, but doesn't necessarily have to be charismatic.
But it seems like nobody wants to admit that they are populists. I mean, it's a term that nobody will buy into, that everybody will sort of disagree with that. Is it necessarily a negative term?
Some people actually do accept it as a kind of rhetorical counteroffensive. So Marine Le Pen, for instance, has said, if being a populist means working and being for the people, I'm a populist. Viktor Orban, the current leader of Hungary, has said, if working for the people and standing up for the people against the European Union and global capitalism is being a populist, I'm a populist. So I think very often, broadly speaking, liberal elites actually set themselves up for a kind of trap when they completely want to exclude discussion with populists and stick the label populist on people, and then populists can come back and say, look, this is exactly what our supporters and we are saying, that this establishment has hijacked the state, they don't even want to talk to us, they don't want to engage with our claims. So in that sense, simply sticking a negative label on somebody actually plays into the hands of actual populists. Having said that, in the, let's say, more normative literature on populism, I think there is no positive use for the term. The only positive thing which sometimes people, in my view, wrongly say is that populism could be a kind of corrective for liberal democracy because they think it helps more popular participation. I think it doesn't.
But that leads me over to the next question, which is, I mean, is it populism a political project in itself, or is it simply a political tool? I mean, can a populist party use a populist tool?
I think a populist, to turn it around, a populist party can certainly use what might at first sight look like a kind of content or a political set of ideas that cannot possibly be appropriated by populists. Let me give you another example. It's usually said that liberal populism, at least in the European context, must be a contradiction in terms. Because liberalism, whatever else you think about it, is about pluralism, is about tolerance. Populism, if you follow my understanding of it, is basically anti-pluralistic. There is only one people, no internal differences, no space for politics, no space for debate. And then somebody like, let's say, Geert Wilders comes along in the Netherlands and, so of course, speaks in the name of liberalism, speaks in the name of the liberal Dutch people who are freedom-loving against, well, various others. So all of a sudden, it seems possible to have a liberal populism. But it's only possible because these liberal values, like freedom, freedom of expression, and so on, they basically come to function as identity builders or identity markers. So they're not really about the values themselves. They are like walls saying, this is the proper Dutch people, and there is, to put it very bluntly, there is Islam, which can never be liberal, which can never be democratic. So what defines the true people is being against that, basically. So in that sense, populism is very flexible in what it appropriates by way of content. But it's not infinitely flexible because it, in my understanding, needs to keep this structure of pitting the one true homogeneous people with the one authentic will against the elites and possibly against those who don't belong at the bottom of society.
And then what is, in your opinion, the explanation for this rise of populism in Europe after the end of the Cold War?
I think there are various factors at work in different contexts. I think it didn't actually even just start with the end of the Cold War. As I've tried to argue in a more historical study, Western European elites after the Second World War came up with a model or understanding of democracy, which I've called constrained democracy, because they drew the lessons from the sort of catastrophes, political catastrophes of mid-20th century Europe, that popular sovereignty was actually a dangerous thing in certain ways. That even parliamentary sovereignty was a dangerous thing, because a parliament could actually hand over all power to a dictator, as happened in 1933 in Germany, as happened in 1940 in France. So they came up with all kinds of institutions that were meant to put certain constraints on popular sovereignty. Examples would be constitutional courts, examples would also be something like the European Council, or even the European Union itself. I'm only mentioning this because in a certain way you might say that in those countries where this model was adopted, and it wasn't adopted everywhere, it hasn't really been that successful in the UK or in Denmark from what I understand, but where it was adopted, it presents a kind of standing invitation to populist actors to say, look, in the political systems we have, the people aren't really present. They're sort of kept at bay, they're kept at a distance, and it's time to really properly bring the people in. So we've seen actually waves of movements, parties that make these sorts of claims over the course of 20th century European history and now 21st century European history. In France, with Poujadisme, for instance, and then especially in the 1970s with anti-tax parties, anti-immigration parties. Beyond that, however, and this I think gets more to the post-Cold War context, we've also, partly because of the end of the Cold War, seen the breakdown of a number of party systems. Best example, probably Italy, where the entire party system was really about keeping communists out of power. That breaks down after 1989. And then obviously the question of who really represents the people is newly in play. And that's where somebody like Berlusconi all of a sudden finds a lot of political space over by now a sort of 20-year period. I mean, he's still around, as we all know, alas.
But I think that's very interesting. So you're saying that actually, I mean, part of the problem has been creating those very institutions which were created exactly to prevent this from happening.
Yes, in a sense, yes. In a sense, a certain anti-populism, if you like, is in the, if you forgive the biological metaphor, is in the DNA of post-war European politics. So I think it's safe to predict
and the
that
DNA of the EU.
and the DNA of the EU in particular, yes, which was and is an elite project in many ways. So I think it's safe to predict that there are always going to be waves of populist movements and parties which will initially make the claim that, look, the people aren't really present. As I tried to say earlier, they don't really want popular participation as such, but it gives them a kind of leverage to start making these sorts of claims. And again, it's maybe worth emphasizing that they will always do so from a moral point of view. It's very noticeable, for instance, that when populists lose, as they of course very often do, they will never really concede that the other side actually really won or is legitimate. To give you one example, when Viktor Orban, who is now in power in Hungary, lost an election in 2002, he famously or infamously said, the nation cannot be in opposition. So even if empirically the other side won, his party uniquely represented the true Hungarian nation. And by definition, the nation cannot be in opposition to itself. Or an example from outside Europe, when the candidate for the Mexican presidency, López Obrador, lost in 2006, and there was a very protracted battle about the election result, he famously said, the victory of the right is morally impossible. So empirically, it's possible. They might have gotten more votes, but morally, it's illegitimate. And that's a very typically populist thing to say.
But to stick to the European aspect to it, or to the EU angle, what if you are a politician sitting in the European Parliament or in the EU Commission in Brussels? I mean, what should be your concern, and what kind of development would you sort of put forward in the EU system to prevent this from being just an elite project and maybe feed into populist movements across Europe?
How many hours do we have again? So there's so many things to say about this,
Yeah.
and I'll restrict myself to maybe 3 if you allow me. So first of all, I think it would be helpful if European elites themselves distinguished more carefully between really dangerous populists and then simply movements and parties that might make the EU's life difficult in certain ways, but who are not populists. So my earlier examples, the Spanish Indignados and the Syriza party. There was a lot of concern, what happens if Syriza comes to power? But I think it would be wrong to simply, in a sense, stamp all these people as populists, therefore negatively label them, and then sort of reinforce the perception that really European elites don't want to be bothered with popular claims from below. Because Indignados are a genuinely popular movement. Syriza is a more complicated story, but is also not really a populist party in the way that I was describing it earlier. So when, for instance, in 2010 already, one of the many European presidents, Herman van Rompuy, said, today populism is the big problem or danger. Only to add that as a Belgian, I know what I'm talking about. In certain ways, he was right. But it was such a general statement that it came across like saying, we just want everything to be quiet. And we don't want, popular mobilizations from below. So point number 1, more carefully distinguish real dangers to democracy and other movements which complicate things, but ultimately could actually be healthy for democracy. Because none of these actors who I was mentioning on the positive side are really anti-European in any meaningful sense. So point number 1. Point number 2, and this is more substantive, is that right now we are in a kind of interregnum, it seems. We know that the old system, especially in the Eurozone, didn't work, cannot go on as it was, but it's not yet clear what a sort of new settlement will be. Most politicians are very, very wary now of basically exposing themselves, risking something, by putting forward a sort of new grand design for anything. But the worry is that one of the designs that is emerging clearly looks a little bit like what some critics have called democracy without choices. By which I mean that very often it's been said, look, the lesson of the euro crisis is that at least within the eurozone, we need to have very strict rules about budget deficits, about what individual member states can do. So we ideally constitutionalize debt breaks. We have the European Commission be like a sort of policeman, or as the somewhat scary German expression then goes a Währungskommissar, who comes along and looks at your numbers and comes to a judgment that no, this is illegitimate, you can't have a budget like this, and so on. So we can debate the economics of this, but the political problem is that then very often, almost as a kind of afterthought, people say, oh, and it also has to be democratic. People have to accept it. But it's very hard to see how such a system, where basically everything is completely set in stone, where there's no real maneuver for national parliaments in certain ways, how that can be democratic, other than in a sort of purely cosmetic sense, that we say, okay, we might be able one day to elect the president of the European Commission, and then you can say, oh, we elected a social democrat and you elected a conservative, and so on. But if that person has no political space to do anything, it really becomes meaningless to speak about democracy. So conversely, I would say the best way to address that, given where we are now, would be to actually create some political space for, let's say, a European Commission that in certain regards is a little bit like a European economic government, so that in a situation, hypothetically, in the next European elections, you as a European citizen could say, if I were to vote for, again hypothetically, Martin Schulz as the leader of the Social Democrats, I'm going to get a somewhat more Keynesian approach in Europe, a growth-oriented one. And if I elect, let's say again hypothetically, Donald Tusk, I'm going to get probably more austerity and a little bit more German medicine for these supposedly lazy Southerners. Now, it doesn't mean that thereby we've created a federal state, because it would still be the member states who say, let's give a certain amount of leeway for the Commission to act in different ways, to have different policy options. And I think this is not wildly utopian, because as it happens, even the nowadays much maligned initial architects of the Eurozone, where nowadays everybody says, why didn't they foresee that we were going to have these problems? Why didn't they see the contradictions in the project? Why didn't they see that there needed to be more coordination? Some of them actually expected, and I think at the time quite reasonably, that by now Europe, the EU, would have a somewhat more significant budget to address basically economic imbalances in the Eurozone. Something like 3% of European GDP, which is not in any way comparable to what a real federal state would have, but historically is actually interestingly at more or less the level that the United States federal government had in the 19th century. So it was just enough to address major economic problems, to shift money around appropriately, but all this could happen without actually creating a federal state, except it won't happen because we are, of course, living through deeply Eurosceptical times. So the last thing that any major politicians in Europe wants to sort of crusade for right now is to say more money for the EU.
Exactly. And that's why the whole debate about Europe's future has been paused partly because of the German election, because nobody wanted to have that as part or important part of the German election and the debate in Germany. So my question is, I mean, everybody knows of course the huge economic impact from Germany on what's happening in Europe, but how do you see Germany more from ideologic standpoint? I mean, how do they, in terms of populism and that whole ideological framework, how do you see Germany there?
In a certain way, even though now all European eyes in a certain way are on Germany, the elections in what most people rightly think is the most powerful country. So it's very understandable that most people think the election is very important. At the same time, we're not going to make a lot of money at the betting shop by betting on who's going to be Chancellor after September 22nd.
No.
Because it seems no matter what, it's going to be the same
yeah.
woman. So I think actually we're going to see more change possibly next year with the European elections, which usually are seen as a kind of sideshow in all this. But it's already often been the case that the European elections, of course, serve as a kind of outlet for all kinds of national frustrations. You think they don't really matter all that much, so I can vote for populist parties, I can vote for even anti-European parties. Now, think of that, and now add to that the factor that after the Euro crisis, I think most people have realized that interdependence is real, that Europe has a real effect on their lives, that it's not this distant Brussels thing that, cares about how long the bananas are, and otherwise you don't have to worry about it, but it affects everything, the welfare state, taxes, everything. So you can imagine a situation where the outcome of the European elections produces an at least partially self-hating European Parliament because it's full of populists and anti-Europeans. So going back to what I talked about a little bit earlier, I think those who say, more democracy in Europe, that must mean a stronger parliament, they may be right, but they also need to think about the fact that the parliament is not automatically, just because it is the European Parliament, going to be pro-European. So we could end up with a very different situation there. Having said that, to come back to the German situation. Again, we live in a kind of interregnum. I think nothing is really set in stone yet about how the Eurozone will be governed and whether Germany will get its way there or not. But I think there are some indications at the moment that, interestingly, the initial German vision, which I hinted at earlier, set everything in stone by law and by constitution, which, by the way, is really the German approach. Everything has to be done by law, by treaty, has to be compatible with what the German Constitutional Court says. So everything has to be done in that very legalistic way. In a certain way, that project is unlikely to go very far right now because of the perceived impossibility of changing the European treaties. Most European elites have decided that at this point it's impossible. It would take 10 years, you would have to have a referendum in Ireland, they might vote no. It's going to be like the last decade, where things drag on forever. The perception will deepen that Europe is dysfunctional, or that if you vote no in a referendum, you will have to vote again until you finally vote yes. So people are very much shying away from that. And then there is, of course, the United Kingdom, which has now committed itself very strongly to saying, as soon as we open up the current package, the current settlement, we want a better deal. So the legalistic proposal is unlikely to go very far right now. So what is instead emerging, but I don't think it's anybody's design, I don't think it was a long-term plan that anybody had, is almost a kind of parallel universe to the EU, which you maybe could call the Euroland, so to speak, which already has a couple of institutions like the European Stability Mechanism and others, which is really much more about national governments coordinating and cooperating and working out pacts and deals and so on and so forth. And that's, if you wanted to put a national cliched label on it, that's actually much more like the French approach, because it gives a lot of discretionary power to governments, to executives. It's sort of running Europe via the nation-state governments. And the European Commission has been very much sidelined in this process. I don't think this is what Angela Merkel wanted. But I think this is sort of the best she can get right now to stabilize things. From the point of view of democracy, it poses even more problems than the actual existing EU structure has, because there is even more going on behind closed doors, even harder to see who is accountable for certain decisions. But this is what we might end up with, and this is also the one thing that absolutely is not being debated right now in the German elections. So if this model turns out not to work, it could really come to haunt, especially the German political establishment, because people might come back and say, look, why did we never talk about this? We never signed really up to this kind of proposal. But right now, everybody is so afraid of risking something by touching this, that essentially the only all-out pro-European integration party, as you know, are the Greens, and they're currently going down in the polls.
You talked earlier about Eastern Europe and populism in Eastern Europe. But since the Euro crisis broke out, especially focus has been on Southern Europe as well. I mean, with huge social problems. I mean, for instance, Spain, I think they have unemployment around 60% amount young people in Spain and so on. I mean, are you worried about populism in Southern Europe?
I am. We clearly already have seen in Greece the rise of a party that is not only populist, but is all-out fascist, and that keeps going up in the polls. So the Golden Dawn party in Greece. In Italy, I think Grillo's movement is very ambiguous. I think Grillo, in some pronouncements, is like a populist. When Grillo says, we want nothing less than 100% in parliament, that for me is a populist and, in that sense, negative statement, because no true Democrat wants 100%. Stalin wants 100%. But a Democrat knows that there are always going to be differences, ongoing conflict, and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think Grillo has put a lot of issues on the agenda which should be on the agenda. So I think that's a true borderline case between dangerous populism and a good corrective to democracy. In Spain, interestingly, the party political landscape hasn't changed all that much. But instead of a new party, of course, we might see a new country. Because in many ways, the pressure that has been building up has found an outlet in the secessionist movement in Catalonia. Now, what do they all nevertheless have in common? I think what they have in common is that in certain ways, nothing less than the overall political settlement, or if you like, the social contract of these countries is at stake. That a previously existing understanding of what the country was about, a kind of overall bargain struck between different groups, how the state should look like, all that has been up for question. The euro crisis, in a sense, triggered this development, but it's not the ultimate cause. The euro crisis is not the cause of, let's say, an overextended Greek state. The cause of an overextended Greek state is also not that, as German tabloids like to have it, the Greeks are lazy and like to live off the state. No, the real historical reason is that Greece had a civil war, and that a typical answer to pacifying a society after a civil war is to extend your state and give both political sides enough jobs in the state. It's basically the same that Austria did after 1945, but it just didn't lead to the same kinds of problems. So I think the problem is that in all these countries, right now, an old social contract is no longer seen as legitimate, a new one hasn't emerged yet, and more worrying perhaps, it's not really clear how a new one could be authorized. What would be a good mechanism for a society to say, okay, we've come to a new understanding how we want to live. Sometimes this might work because you have a grand coalition of all parties saying, look, we really have to move forward together. We are all on board for this, we are all on this together. And you might at first sight say, well, that's actually how it looks like right now in Greece and Italy, because you have parties which were always completely at loggerheads, currently in grand coalitions. You would never have thought that Berlusconi's party and the left could ever cooperate, yet they do. You would never have thought that the Greek left and New Democracy, the right-wing party, could cooperate, yet they do. The problem is, if you are a Greek or Italian citizen, I think this doesn't look to you like, oh, this is a great founding moment for a new social contract. I think to you this looks much more like the old parties who had basically hijacked the state and divided it amongst themselves, now in a moment of crisis are forgetting all their ideological differences and working together to hold on to this old model. So I think it doesn't look good on that score. The alternative, what people can also imagine as a way to sort of engineer a moment of refoundation and finding a new social contract might be to think about crafting a new constitution. And we've seen some examples of this too. Think of the, alas, ill-fated, it seems, Icelandic so-called crowdsourced constitution, where there was a sense after the financial crisis that the old establishment had so badly managed things that the old social contract was no longer legitimate, that you really needed to hand it back to the people in a certain way. The same was tried in Ireland, where there's still an ongoing constitutional process with a constitutional convention, where people were randomly selected from different parts of the country to sit in this convention. Alas, I think in both cases, by now, it's safe to say that there's a very strong perception that the old establishment parties have come back and have either stopped this process, as in Iceland, or they've essentially hijacked it and made it very harmless, as in Ireland.
But when you talk about creating a new constitution, you mean a national constitution?
Yes.
But what about an EU constitution, a different EU constitution?
So, again, that goes back to the whole question of a grand design. I think that, in theory, you might say that we are much closer now to a real constitutional moment than, let's say, 10 years ago, when European elites were spending years and years, with great fanfare, actually crafting a constitutional treaty and convincing, national populations that we now absolutely need this constitution for Europe to work. Well, the constitution was voted down in 2 founding members of the EU, and the world didn't collapse and the EU didn't collapse. So it seems, the constitutional moment that was bandied about at that time wasn't really a constitutional moment. It was really just another attempt to kind of sell Europe to the people and in a very awkward and ultimately unsuccessful way. There was no real substantive reason why there had to be a constitutional treaty back then. Now you might say it's really the opposite. There really needs to be a new, if you like, social contract as well across the Eurozone as a whole, because people have woken up to the fact of interdependence. What we do here matters over there, what they do over there matters over here. If even tiny Greece can bring down the whole structure, we need to kind of find ways of coordinating our actions. We need to factor into our national politics what they do, and in a sense our national politics need to understand what effects our decisions have on them. So in a sense it would be a much better moment now to think of a new constitutional mechanism that allows that sort of coordination to take place in a legitimate and ideally democratic way. But, as I tried to say earlier, the elites are so afraid right now of opening up this can of worms that as soon as you mention the C word, people polite you sort of push you out of the room because everybody is still so traumatized by the last constitution-making process, and everybody thinks that in any case, practically, even treaty change isn't possible right now. So where does that leave us? Well, it in a sense actually then throws it back to European citizens to say, well, look, we actually want a really explicit settlement, and we don't want this parallel Euroland universe where we don't really understand what's going on, we don't really understand who's in charge, we don't know who to hold accountable. So ultimately, in a sense, it falls back on European citizens. Well, I guess Denmark is not in the Eurozone, so I shouldn't blame you. But for those of you who might be in the Eurozone here, I think now is the time to say that, look, we would like to see this done differently.
And what is the right approach for the establishment, as you call it, or the elite, to deal with populist movements? As you gave a few examples of them actually working together on a national level, is that the right approach to embrace them? Or
I think the important thing is not to indirectly play into the hands of populists by acting in exactly the way that populists would predict elites act. So to simply dismiss them and say, well, you're a populist, I'm not talking to you. You're a populist, I'm not even listening to what kind of complaints and arguments and problems you want to bring into the political arena. So I think a kind of engagement is always the right answer, as long as you're not dealing with parties that, let's say, openly embrace violence. So again, I think it's important to distinguish between different phenomena. I think Golden Dawn in Greece is a party that ideally should be banned. I don't think there should be neo-Nazi parties openly competing in European politics, but that's not for me to decide. I think that's a question that can be decided at national level. But I think for populists, it would be the right strategy is not just sort of high-handed dismissal, but to say, look, let's engage. What actual arguments do you have? Not to buy into their image of the true people, but to really bring it down to arguments and facts. Now, you can say that's very rationalistic, that's a typical sort of idealistic academic dream that the better argument will win out, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me the wrong strategy to say, oh, we're going to outcompete them on the level of passions, or we're going to show that we truly represent the people, and they don't. Because I don't think you're going to win that game.
So you started by saying that you were actually worried about what's happening in Southern Europe and maybe in Eastern Europe as well. What's to you is the nightmare scenario?
Unfortunately, I have many nightmares. It's not always the same, but I look. Let me preface the answer by saying that I don't mean to sound like it's Euro apocalypse now. That we're just sort of a step away from a sort of Weimar-style collapse of liberal democracies across Europe, or anything like that. I don't think that's the case. But I think we are, even if in the Eurozone things were to stay calm, I think we're still in for a number of rough years within individual countries and possibly across the EU as a whole, because it's very hard to see how in Southern Europe people will arrive at a new legitimate settlement, and it's very hard to see how, at least in some Central and Eastern European countries, a kind of basic liberal democratic consensus which held for a number of years after 1989, at least in some countries, can be properly restored. I think there the situation is a little bit different in that you don't actually necessarily have a lot of polarization at the level of populations, but you have political establishments which are deeply antagonistic and split, and where basically a lot of the times the legitimacy of one's main opponent is denied. So you see that, for instance, in Hungary, where the government says the socialists aren't really properly representing Hungary. You see this in Romania, you now see this in Bulgaria, and even in the Czech Republic, which again had been one of these sort of paragons of liberal democratic virtue for a while after '89. In the last couple of months, we've seen an almost Weimar-style confrontation between a directly elected president who claims that he truly represents the people, and then the parliament. So this is not, day-to-day political conflict where you can say, people are a bit at each other's throats, but it'll be fine. These are fairly systemic problems, sometimes but not always rooted in political culture. If we didn't have the euro crisis right now, I think a lot of us, especially European elites, would be much more worried about this. They would see a pattern and they would say, it's not just one bad apple. Oh, Hungary is doing something funny, but that's just one weird guy. Everything else is fine. No, it's much more widespread. It's a general phenomenon. And even in a sort of, by now, showcase for success like Poland, where everybody says, look, this is a fantastic European success story. Economically, the only country since the financial crisis that has been growing all the way through, seems to have a stable political system right now, and so on. Even there, the remaining Kaczynski is making a comeback. Now imagine a country as big as Poland joining the others in this category. All of a sudden, I think people would realize, look, we thought, after accession to the EU, everybody was living, on the island of the blessed forever after, and it's not true.
So in other words, you're saying we're focusing on the wrong conflict or the wrong problem?
The Eurozone problems are real, and that's why, in a sense, that's why I was talking also about problems in the South. But I think because this has been so much in the news, and we've been limping from crisis summit to crisis summit, I think it's been easier to not so much worry about these other situations. Of course, there's also a fair amount of, if I may say so, prejudice involved. That there was always a sense that, well, these countries are only half European anyway, so we're not so surprised that, their democracies aren't working out so well. But it's worth remembering that the great promise of the EU was always, as soon as you declared ready to join the club, you are a fully certified, proper liberal democracy. If you're in, you will of course stay in as a properly liberal democratic country, because why would you ever want to go back to any kind of other system? And that promise, that hope, has turned out to be an illusion.
And could you imagine any of the current EU member states actually taking the consequence and leaving the European Union?
It's very hard to see right now that anybody would actually take that final consequence. It's maybe worth also pointing out that actually nobody could be made to leave. Legally right now, a country is of course allowed to voluntarily leave the EU, and that was often trumpeted as a great achievement of the Lisbon Treaty, that now it was possible to kind of basically politely say goodbye to the club and do your own thing. But if you saw a massive deterioration in liberal democracy in a member state, a number of sanctions would be available to the EU, but you couldn't actually take the ultimate step and say, you are a military dictatorship now, you must leave. And again, I think we don't have that option because people thought it could never possibly happen. Why would anybody ever want to do anything like that? Now, just on one last point on this, I think the most worrying development in this regard, in terms of an actual political leader who is exercising power right now, at least keeping that option on the table, I think is Hungary's Viktor Orban, who in a sense has pursued a strategy which many observers have found irrational, because if you look at polls in Hungary, many people remain fairly pro-EU. So what has sometimes been called his war of independence from us, that is, has not been terribly popular. But the thought is that maybe he wants to keep that option in the background of one day saying, look, this club of the EU, which is of course run by German and Austrian multinationals and which is against the interests of the true Hungarian people, is detrimental, and we ought to leave. It's not completely impossible.
Before we leave the EU and Europe for a while, I'd like you to also bring in the news media. I mean, in terms of populism, you said earlier that we're basically focusing too little on populist movements and too much on the Euro crisis. How do you see the news media, which is rapidly changing these years as well? How do you see them playing to that whole new development?
I think there the issue is no different than the issue for political elites in general. That I think responsible news coverage involves a certain ability to draw distinctions. I mean, ultimately, you could even say what it means to have good political judgment is to be able to distinguish different phenomena and not label everything with the same term because it's convenient, because that's just lazy. And you don't look closely at what a party or a movement is actually doing. So I think the best that can be hoped for is that journalists as well try to form as comprehensive a picture about individual phenomena and then say, well, a certain label really does apply to them, or maybe it actually doesn't, because at first it might look like they are populists of a certain stripe, but actually they're not. But in that sense, that's not exclusive to journalists either, because ideally all citizens would invest in forming good political judgments, which also means you can never simply sort of have a pre-existing model or the civics textbook and say, oh, they fit this model, okay, check.
But that's right, but you can also say, well, just 10 years ago, news media were very much controlled by the elite. I mean, newspapers, television stations, and so on. But now, I mean, the news media can also be populist in the sense that everybody is a journalist today. You can write on Twitter, you can write on, Facebook and the whole social media has sort of democratized the whole news business. So that creates also a different picture where the news media is not necessarily establishment anymore.
Yes, but this in a certain way would help my anti-populist argument, because the populists would always claim we exclusively represent and speak for the people. And if there are many other actually existing people who say something different, that helps the argument that society is actually much more complex and differentiated than the person who says everybody who is the true people thinks basically like me. And so in that sense, I'm not so pessimistic. I mean, there have always been tabloids in Europe and elsewhere. That hasn't changed, hasn't gotten any better, it hasn't gotten any worse. So I think more diversity and more possibilities for people to articulate themselves in a certain way, even though for other people that's exactly populist because the people say stupid things, but on my account, that's actually helpful for countering populist claims for exclusive representation and showing that they're actually wrong.
I know that most of your research and your writings have been focusing on Europe particularly, but I think it's difficult to have this talk without bringing in the Middle East, because everybody now is following what's happening in Syria. I mean, the Arab Spring has been quite a ride for people to follow what happened in Egypt, where everybody was sort of optimistic about Arab Spring. And here again, you had, I wouldn't label it a populistic movement, but at least you had people revolting the establishment, and then they elected a leader, and that wasn't acceptable. I mean, how do you see the development in the Middle East with sort of the framework of your populist theory?
Well, you're very polite to say that wasn't acceptable, because the question is, of course, it wasn't acceptable to whom exactly and why. But in my framework, I would say that the Arab Spring was a real popular moment, a real moment of popular participation, where people came out. They actually, unlike my earlier example about Berlusconi and people staying at home and watching TV, of course they really did come out to the squares, and they made the claim that people also famously made in 1989, that they really were the people, and that those who spoke for them didn't speak for them. It's very different to make that claim in a dictatorship than to make that claim in a liberal democracy that might have all kinds of deficiencies and faults, but where populists will say we exclusively represent the real people, whereas in a dictatorship to say, look, we are the people, and those in power and who never ask us actually don't represent us. So that a quite different logic applies there, and there was real popular participation. However, you could say that the Muslim Brotherhood then actually pursued a program that was populist in my sense, in the sense that they crafted a constitution, that they tried to impose a settlement that was predicated on the idea that only those who were like the Muslim Brotherhood really had a place in Egypt, that only they were the true Egyptian people, and everybody else had to be excluded or marginalized or had to have some kind of detrimental outcome. So in that sense, I think in that specific sense, populism applies. And that effort failed so far. But in a sense, the challenge remains how you can find, again, coming back to this earlier language, how you can find a social contract where all the contending groups in society can say, okay, this is a settlement we can live with, and this is not simply one part of society lording it over the other part of society. Because as long as that is the perception, you're never going to have a stable, liberal, democratic framework.
No, and that raises the question, are we in the West ready to accept true democracy in the Middle East?
Meaning, we're only accepting it as long as the outcome is
what we expect or we hope for.
As we like to see it. Well, I mean, clearly there have been instances, and that has been the usual pattern for a long time, that yes, people would officially say, of course, we are for democracy, but actually, tacitly, we're very happy with Mubarak-style characters because they, keep a lid on all kinds of extremist phenomena. I think by now everybody hopefully would have understood that this was profoundly mistaken because the Mubarak-style characters didn't keep a lid on phenomena. They were, of course, tacitly encouraging these phenomena because that was their best justification forever to stay in power. So I think it was always a profound mistake to think that, occasionally we support dictators because they prevent, worse things from happening. They always were encouraging, keeping alive and encouraging worse things because that was their best claim to power. So I don't think we should go back to anything like that for normative reasons, but even if you're a very hard-nosed realist, you should have understood that this doesn't actually work. Right now, in general, I think maybe will be seen 50 years from now, as historians start writing about our present. They will probably write a little bit about the Eurozone crisis, but they might also come to the conclusion that actually the truly momentous development of our time was the Arab Spring, something that happened not in some faraway corner of the world, but right on Europe's doorstep. And that Europe essentially slept through this development. And that it was just a kind of lazy excuse to say, we shouldn't be so involved because there's all this colonial baggage and this, traumatic past. So yes, we'll help a little bit, but, we don't really want to be too involved in all this. Clearly, the EU is not going to offer membership to Egypt tomorrow. But I think this completely standoffish stance contrasts strikingly, and I would say tragically, with the stance that the EU took in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Because you could have said very similar things then. You could have said, Central and Eastern Europe has always been very unstable, the Balkans already at war again, the Germans shouldn't be involved because think of the legacy of the Second World War, so they shouldn't really try to do anything there, and so on and so forth. So I think it's in many ways just a lazy excuse. It says something about Europe's weakness and unwillingness to really think beyond, the next day.
But having said that, don't you think it has something to do with the fact that we had been fighting two very expensive wars? I mean, the one in Afghanistan and one in Iraq. So there is a certain fatigue, at least if you talk about Syria, to go in and be active again.
I'm not saying that we should, send out the troops and fight lots of wars in the Middle East. But I think by now the EU has both knowledge and resources as far as questions of how do you enable a successful transition to liberal democracy is concerned. Now, of course, it has been somewhat involved. I don't want to be completely dismissive. But in general, this is something that officially has been treated with a great deal of distance, and it's not really been something that politicians have tried to bring to the table in European discussions. Now, I understand that this is, again, not a winning proposition. I mean, if you're a politician right now, I understand that apart from all your other worries, you don't want to say, by the way, I've got a couple of great ideas about the Middle East. I know that's not a vote winner. But again, think back to the early 90s. There was enough prejudice in Europe to say, what do you mean? We're going to be in the same club as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all these faraway countries, all the kind of mental maps of the Cold War, which younger generations, I think, have completely forgotten. Rightly so, and it's a good thing. But if you lived through that time, as a politician, you had to take somewhat of a risk and say, look, we want all them to be in the club. We want to do something proactive. It's going to cost something. It's going to be an effort. It's going to take time and so on. So I think that should be a more inspiring example. And even though it contradicts a little bit what I said earlier, because I talked about the fact that actually accession wasn't just a complete success story, that we're seeing a certain amount of reverse trends in a number of countries, still overall, I think it's an amazing European achievement. And it's something that we should make more of.
I think before we wrap up, we have about 5 minutes left. I think I'd like to talk about America, United States, and we talked about both national constitutions in Europe, but also the European Constitution. And I'd like you to elaborate a little bit about the American Constitution, because that was partly created by the founding fathers actually to prevent populism, and it has created a system where nothing is happening, no decisions are made, because they are stuck in their checks and balances, and the Congress doesn't speak to the White House, and it's completely frozen politically. But how do you see the American experiment from the trying to prevent populism from happening?
Well, it's both the worst of all possible worlds and it's the best of all possible worlds. It's the best of all possible worlds, just to start on the positive side, in the sense that, there have been waves and waves of populist movements in the United States. This is not a new phenomenon. The Tea Party isn't the first populist movement. And yet the system has found ways of dealing with them, of absorbing them, without, in a sense, mainstream parties simply becoming necessarily populist themselves. So there are many flaws in the American system. There are many legal scholars who by now say, look, if only we could get rid of this constitution. It was great for the 18th century, but by the way, it has all kinds of flaws because it was a constitution for a society that had slavery. There are all kinds of issues that bring about the situation you described in terms of gridlock, a society where long-term problems can't be addressed, and so on and so forth. So there is actually kind of developing discussion about how the Constitution should not be venerated as a kind of quasi-sacred object, but ideally should be thrown out. Don't worry, it's not going to happen. But there is a meaningful discussion about its flaws. So it's not just all, completely uncritical patriotism. But at the same time, I think you can credit the system not just with stability, but with a certain capacity for absorption. So that was the good news. The bad news is, of course, that right now we're seeing a situation where one party, over recent history, really has massively, in a sense, adopted a certain kind of populism. And
you're talking about
the Republicans and the Tea Party. And whereas when many people say, US politics is so much more polarized now, it's not quite true, because that implies an image, where both parties sort of move to the extreme. But the Democratic Party hasn't moved to any kind of extreme. The Democratic Party remains wonderfully friendly to Wall Street, etc., right? It's the Republican Party that has adopted a completely destructive stance, of course, in Congress, but also committed itself ideologically in certain ways, where it's very hard to see how they're going to reverse themselves anytime soon.
And you think that is because of the Tea Party?
Yes, I think it's partly a strategy simply to say, okay, we're going to oppose this president as much as we can. So we're not going to enable him to take any credit for any achievement wherever we can. And unfortunately, of course, by now we have a situation where, as you know, the already existing checks and balances, in a sense, through now established practices like the filibuster, have become even more severe. So that now it's accepted that actually you need an even higher majority in the Senate to get anything done. So the system is not becoming unfrozen; it's becoming even more frozen in certain ways. And you combine that with a party that is set on basically on a kind of destructive course, and is willing to stick to these very strong ideological commitments. The hope, just to end on a more hopeful note, is, of course, that they realized at one point that electorally, this is not a winning strategy. That actually, given what has now been often debated, given the changing demographics of the country, given certain long-term trends, yes, you can always lock in this one strong, if you like, populist constituency, but overall, that's not going to win you elections. And sooner or later, every rational politician is going to worry about that.
That must unfortunately be the last word. We've been talking for an hour. It has been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.